Hi everyone, today we're going to do a quick review of nationalism from your reading. So you should just take notes on the handout that says Post-World War I Growth of Nationalism Review. So the first question is, why did nationalism increase in many parts of the world following World War I? So go ahead and pause the video and discuss this question as a class. Think about what different parts of the world had contributed to World War I, and that should guide you in your answer. So the first area we're going to look at is the Middle East, and remember the Ottoman Empire fell at the end of World War I. So go ahead and pause and discuss this question. What factors led to the fall of the Ottoman Empire? So think about the war itself, and then also you can kind of think back to what you previously studied about why the Ottoman Empire was struggling even before the war. So once you're done discussing, just notice these maps. So it shows you the Ottoman Empire in 1914, before World War I. And then at the end of World War I, by 1922, sorry about the bell, by 1922, you can see that it's divided up into all different countries, more like it is today. So now we're just going to look at what emerged as a result of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So the first thing is the country of Turkey. So I'm going to go over some changes in Turkey. I don't think you need to list all of these, but you can definitely put down a few examples, and I would definitely put Mustafa Kemal or Ataturk on there. So President Mustafa Kemal, also known as Ataturk, is pictured here. And he's really responsible for trying to transform Turkey into a modern country. So hopefully you discussed a minute ago that one of the issues the Ottomans had is that they had really fallen behind in terms of technology and industrialization and things like that. And so Ataturk really saw that if Turkey is going to survive, they need to modernize quickly and kind of get with the program that the West is doing if they want to be able to trade and things like that with the West. And I think you can kind of see that even in this picture, because if you look at him, he's dressed like a Western European type person would be in this time. So changes in Turkey. Turkey became a republic. A republic is just a government with some representation at least and no king. They changed the Turkish language to make it written in the Roman alphabet like we use in the West. All people had to adopt last names, which was not a common practice before this, but like in the Western world, we have a first name and a last name. And the government started to rapidly build factories. Ataturk also tried to make Turkey a more secular state. So even though most people then and now in Turkey are Muslim, they put restrictions on how much religion could really impact daily life, I would say. So, for example, women were forbidden from wearing the veil. Women were given marriage and inheritance rights equal to men, and eventually women even got the right to vote. Citizens were also allowed to convert to other religions, which in some countries, even today, like Saudi Arabia, it's illegal to convert to any religion other than Islam. So he really wanted to modernize Turkey and try to, in a lot of ways, westernize it. So the next section are the Arab mandates. After World War I, a lot of Arabs saw an opportunity to escape Ottoman rule, but they were not sure what should replace it. And the Arabs in this region, the map pretty much shows you like the areas, except for Iran, the areas where Arabic is widely spoken. So these people are united by, in some ways, a common religion and a common language, but not necessarily by much else. And so people were unsure exactly how they were going to undertake forming new governments in this region. It says on here to read the article, which we are skipping this year, so just don't worry about that. And remember, the mandate system basically established the parts of the old Ottoman Empire as almost like colonies of the French and British. So I would definitely put that down. They were colonized more or less by the French and the British, And this greatly inspired nationalism among these different groups because they had been ruling themselves under the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. And now all of a sudden, at the end of World War I, it's almost as if the Europeans are saying, you're not really capable of governing yourselves. We're going to come in and help you. And so this created a lot of nationalist feelings in response to, really, it's like a backlash against British and French rule in this region. And then the last section we'll talk about in the Middle East is Palestine. So Palestine was also established as a mandate, but because the issues in Palestine led to other things we're going to talk about, like the creation of Israel, we're going to talk about it separately. So Palestine was a British mandate after World War I. Palestine, we know, is traditionally the homeland of the Jews, so that's where Judaism started. But a lot of Jews had not lived there since really the time of the Romans, when they were forced out due to persecution. And so in this time period, the very early 20th century, Palestine was mostly inhabited by Muslim Palestinians. In 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which said it would support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This caused a lot of issues with the Muslims living in Palestine, who felt like this was already their territory, and so as they saw people different from them moving in great numbers to Palestine, it caused some conflict and controversy. There was also a movement during this time called the Zionist movement, which encouraged Jews to move to Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration encouraged this even more. So the Zionist movement basically said, or promoted the idea that Jews should reclaim their homeland. And then this continued as we have the rise of Nazism in Germany in the 1930s and other totalitarian governments. There's a lot of Jews who are moving from Europe to Palestine to escape persecution. And this caused increasing tension between Jews and Muslims in this region. And so by 1939, the British, seeing this, get kind of concerned about it and start to limit the number of Jews that can move there to try to limit any sort of conflict that might occur. Now let's talk about Africa. So many Africans had fought in World War I on the side of Europeans, and they hoped they would be given independence after the war because of all they had contributed. So we talked about that when we studied World War I. Instead, what happened is that the German colonies, rather than becoming independent, actually were turned over to the French and the British after the war. What also had happened is that Africans had learned about new ideas like freedom and nationalism and democracy through their colonial governments and also through their involvement in World War I. And so Africans as a whole began to seek reform after World War I and move for independence. Most of these movements were not very successful. One of them is Pan-Africanism, which was in your chapter. Pan-Africanism did not really work out. Well, first of all, let's identify what it is. Pan-Africanism is the idea that all of Africa should work together to gain independence. This did not work because Africa is a huge and very diverse continent. So there's so many different ethnicities and languages and religions. It was really hard to get everyone on the same page to move for independence. Egypt is its own separate issue. So if you'd like to, you could pause and talk about what happened in Egypt, and then I'll go over it. Okay, so in Egypt, Egypt had issues. It was increasingly being dominated by the British. Debt remained a major problem. Nationalism had grown. Eventually, the British granted them a constitution and some representation, and it led to widespread revolts. The nationalism in Egypt led to widespread revolts. And eventually, the British withdrew in 1922. So lastly is India, and there's a series of questions here. So I'll ask each question, and then if you'd like to, you can pause the video and talk about it, and then I'll go over the answer for each one. So first off is who led nationalist movements in India. So go ahead and pause that if you would like to. A lot of the people who led nationalist movements in India were Western educated people who had gained, we talked about previously how in imperialism, a lot of these countries educated the upper classes so that they could work for the government. And so that kind of, in some ways, backfired, because now you have some people who have an education and know about government in the West, and they want that for themselves. And so those tended to be the leaders of the nationalist movements. The next one is, what was the goal of the Indian National Congress? So the Indian National Congress initially wanted a share in governing. So they wanted people to have more representation than they did before. When they saw that the British were really not willing to work with them and give up much in that area, then they began to push for independence. What other movements began? So the movements, aside from the Indian National Congress, a lot of them focused on specific religious groups. So there were people who wanted independence and wanted it to be dominated by Hindus. There were people who wanted independence and they wanted to limit the role of Hindus. There were people who wanted violent overthrow and wanted to use terroristic methods. So there were differing views of whether it should be achieved peacefully or through violence. There were differing views over the role of religion in this. So the Indian National Congress, for example, was supposed to be people of all religions. And remember, the two major religions here are Islam and Hinduism. Okay, what changes occurred after World War I? So in your reading, it went over a number of different reform movements after World War I, which had mixed results. Ultimately, I would say they did not grant enough representation or self-rule to satisfy the Indian people. Okay, and then lastly, who was Gandhi and what tactics did he use? So Gandhi was a Western-educated lawyer. He grew up in India, but he actually went to school and to university in Britain. He, after that, spent some time in South Africa as a lawyer and eventually came back to India as he saw the issues that Indians were facing under the British. So his tactics, he used nonviolent non-cooperation. Another term for this is civil disobedience. So in civil disobedience, this is what a lot of people used in America during the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King Jr., if you're familiar with that. So in civil disobedience, these people often are breaking the law in what they're doing, but they're not harming anyone else in the process. So if you again think about Martin Luther King Jr., he, for example, and a lot of his followers in the civil rights movement in the United States were arrested because they were protesting in ways where it was illegal to even assemble and protest. So they were arrested and went to jail, but they were not harming anyone else. They used totally nonviolent methods, did not fight back, things like that. And so Gandhi's movement is similar. And actually, Gandhi, in many ways, inspired Martin Luther King Jr. later. Okay, so I'll talk about a couple of these tactics that you're going to see in the video that you're going to watch in a minute. So the picture on the left represents the homespun cloth movement. So remember, the British, when they took over India, brought in all of these manufactured textiles from the factories in Britain, and that had the effect of putting out of business a lot of Indian industries because they were using cottage industries homemade cloth. They also made a lot of people switch from growing food to cotton and indigo, which caused famine. And so the homespun cloth movement, Gandhi said, we're going to boycott British cloth and you're going to make your own cloth at home in the traditional way. And so we're not buying British cloth and that hurts British industry. Okay, so again, it's like a nonviolent way of still protesting and having an economic impact. So in this image, he is spinning his own thread, and you'll see that in the video. The second image represents the salt march, which you'll see. So salt is a product we all need to survive for daily life. And the British had put a high tax on salt that a lot of the Indian people could not afford. And so Gandhi led the salt march, which was over 200 miles. He marched through India to the Indian Ocean to make salt out of the Indian Ocean. So from the salt water of the ocean, they made salt and began selling it. And you'll see again the reaction of the British in the video. But those are two important examples of nonviolent tactics that Gandhi used.